Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Taylor. I am Vice President and General Manager of Crane's Global Polymer Group, and that includes Plastics News. And I'll be your host today. Today's webinar is brought to you by our sponsor and our friends at ResinSmart by RTI. And here's what we're going to dig into today with ResinSmart by RTI. Using this year's polyethylene run-up, we're going to talk about the structure of the resin market. And using that case study, we're going to talk about separating real feedstock cost from supplier margin. We'll also talk about how to read live market signals before that price increase hits, and 3 shifts that winning buyers are making. The folks joining me today are going to pull back the curtain on this whole process. They're former resin buyers and sellers, and they're going to walk through the exact signals that smart buyers use to read that market. You'll also learn some concrete moves that you can put to work right away. Those are things like building a data foundation to the exact supplier conversation that you should be having. You're going to get a live look at buyer-side intelligence that ResinSmart sends clients as well. I'm super excited to have with us today from ResinSmart, Michael Workman, the Executive Director, Bill Bowie, he's founder and co-owner, and Tyler Wheeler, Director of Engineered Resins. Quick housekeeping note before we get started too, just to give you some background of the screen you're looking at. You can ask a question at any point during the webinar. So you'll see that Q&A box on your screen. It's real simple. Just drop your question in that box at any time. It sends it to us, and we'll when we're done with the presentation, we'll use the rest of our time to go through your questions and get you some answers. And I'll tell you, if we get a lot and they don't get to your question, these guys are super good about following up, being there for you. You'll have contact information to reach out to them as well. So again, super excited to have Michael, Bill, and Tyler with us today from RTI to talk about ResinSmart. And I'm going to flip it over to Michael now. It's all yours.
Chris, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Hope everybody out there is having a great summer. I grew up reading the Plastics News as I got into this industry 15 years ago. So again, couldn't be happier to be back in this forum. I am Michael Workman with ResinSmart by RTI. We have built a procurement empowerment platform that buyers are using today to gain back leverage at the negotiation table. We're not here today to talk about what happened this year. We'll touch on it a little bit, but we're here to really talk about, focus the conversation around what you as the resin buyer can be doing differently moving forward, starting today. As Chris mentioned, the resin market has been structurally stacked against the resin buyer really since the very beginning. And for about 40 minutes here, we're going to pull back that curtain on exactly how that works, why it keeps working, and what the buyers that are winning right now in today's market are doing differently. I am absolutely privileged to be joined by 2 people that have been spending their careers on this challenge. Bill Bowie, you didn't just live the buyer's pain. He built a company for it, right? Starting in 1998. And Tyler Wheeler, you lead our engineered resins material practice here. And you're the person I call when something doesn't make sense in the engineered resin space. I think there's no better place to start than where every resin buyer's frustration begins, which is the moment that the realization that the game was never really fair to begin with. Bill, I can't think of any better place to start, anyone better to talk about this and kick us off than you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's great to be here today, and thanks Plastics News for hosting this great opportunity to share some insights to the market. Little over 40 years in the industry, and I saw early. I've shared in the past. I had the opportunity to start at Polymerica and learn from one of the true pioneers of the plastics industry, Stephen Ross. And one of the first things I learned from him was the value of a half penny. Now, if you knew Stephen Ross or ever dealt with him, that probably really was 5 or 6 cents. But the fact is, he taught you the value of a half a penny. And if you could buy a little better than your competition, be more on top of the market, you have an advantage all the way through the process of putting your product out on the other end and selling it to clients. Early in my career, I went for From there, I went to Daskasil, and my business partner at RTI, we started the business a little over 28 years ago, Garland Strong. He and I realized that there was a real gap. In fact, I was sharing with some friends the other day that when I first got to Daskasil, I was looking for a way to engage in the industry a little bit more, and I joined SPE, the Society of Plastics Engineers. And being involved in that group, I saw pretty quickly how isolated resin buyers are, how we're in our own little cocoon. And I've never seen a resin buyer or a buyer in general that doesn't have enough to do. Because in the morning, you're buying paper clips and you're buying envelopes and you're working with the engineers to design a new mold and make sure you've got all the details correct to go out and get those bids, a new screw for an extruder, on and on and on constantly that the buyers are dealing with. And then in the afternoon, a large producer comes in, and that sales guy has over 500 transactional data from all over the globe on that computer, and he knows exactly what the market price is in that moment in time. And unfortunately, there's such a gap between the information that's readily available for a buyer to know what's going on in the market and what's happening today and what he's looking at in the next day, week, coming forward to make a knowledgeable decision based on facts and data. And that's where certainly you guys at ResinSmart have filled that gap.
You talked about the data asymmetry problem, Bill, the supplier walking in with more information. And a lot of buyers we talk to might have some market intelligence. They might have some, they have their own invoice prices. They may have, some PDFs, right? Some just not enough, right? There's this data asymmetry challenge. Now, there are the indexes that are in the market. And to be very clear, the index isn't the problem. It's what it can tell you, right? The index measures the market. It doesn't measure what you stack up against. I know you're pretty passionate about this, Bill. I'll let you.
Yeah, Michael, you've heard me say many times, I God bless the guys doing indexes. I wouldn't want the job. It's really difficult. In fact, again, thinking about preparing for today, I thought, think about an index as getting information from a producer and from buyers, everything from 500,000 pounds to somebody that's buying 1 billion pounds, and they're trying to filter that information to come up with how much the market moved. But how much does that mean to me? In my specific case, and how many pounds I buy and what grade I buy, the producers I buy from, do I have competition? Do I pay my bills in 90 days or do I pay my bills in 30 days? All that's going to move that index price, but they can't represent all that on an index, right? They have to call it balls and strikes the best they can with that broad set of information, not specific to you. And that's where data and information is critical. And there's a number of ways to do that. Like you said, there's research. You can get on the internet today. That's all stuff that we didn't have when I first started. There's places you can find information. First question is how current is it, and how relatable it is it to my business? Can I relate that information to my business and apply it to me? That's the real difficult part. You can talk to the market. You can develop relationships with brokers, with other sellers, which is typically hard to do, right? Because I got my price and I'm a buyer and I don't really necessarily want to tell you where I'm at. So there's difficulties with all that shared information. But the big problem is time. As I've gotten older, I realize there's really only 3 things we can offer our family and our community and our job. It's time, talent, and treasure, right? I can work on the treasure. I can do a great job. I can get my bonuses and increase my salary. I can work on that. Talent, hey, the more I study, the more I read, the more I talk to people, I can improve that talent. But none of us can control time. And to really get a grasp of what's going on in this huge industry that's global, that's impacted by all the, as we've seen in the last 5 months, right, is impacted by everything that's going on in the world. It's really hard to get a handle on that with the amount of time it would take to do that without having someone in your corner helping you do that.
And that's especially Oh, please, Tyler, go ahead.
Well, just to add on to that, Bill, I know that in my 10 years of buying resin for some large companies, that was one of the first pitches I had to make to leadership was, if you really want excellence all the way down this 100-long SKU list, then I need an analyst. Because if what you want me to do is monitor markets, monitor feedstocks, monitor margin, on a per SKU per month basis for our entire multi-plant portfolio, then that's going to be my only job. And unfortunately, that's not the job of a resin buyer. It tends to be, because it has to be. But the real job of a resin buyer is to be out there building relationships, getting to know the sales folks. Like Bill always says, talk to many, work with a few. So I think that, it's the data asymmetry and just how much work has to go into managing and monitoring that ongoing data to even discover where you should be negotiating. So it's an incredible problem on the time front for resin buyers.
It really is. And, I think I've shared with Michael before, I wouldn't do my own taxes, right? I don't try and diagnose my own health. If I was called into court, I wouldn't represent myself. I would have an expert standing next to me helping me do that because A, I don't have the expertise, and B, I don't have the time. And that's where we're utilizing outside resources to help you find the information you need to plan tomorrow and the next day when you make that buy. Not what happened yesterday. Doesn't do a lot of good.
In addition to that, guys, when we see price increase letters coming in to organizations, and I know you buyers out there probably have them sent to a specific box in your email because you're tired of getting all of them clogging up your inbox. There's the reality that those price increases have a cost component and have a margin component, right? And understanding which is which can be very challenging for certain organizations. Tyler, I know you have a great example of how you kind of came upon that in polycarbonate in your prior career.
Yeah, there was a time where I was managing a pretty large resin spend, and this was, number 10 on the list, right? And a lot of times as resin buyers, we're given a percentage target. So we have to Pareto our spend and, really be excellent with the top 3 or 4 SKUs. But what about that 10th one? And when I started to investigate it, I was like, okay, I guess I don't really know that much about the polycarbonate market. How do I know if, $2 a pound is a fair price, for example? So I start off by looking, do I buy this direct or through distribution? Okay, it's through distribution. So we challenge them a little bit just on a generic, like, hey, this feels expensive. Some other markets have gone down. I notice our price hasn't gone down with you. That drove an immediate, 10 cents a pound give back. And I thought, okay, well, that must mean that there's some maybe more meat on this bone. So then as you go through the process and you build out an RFP and you understand what other materials might even be able to be used, and you understand if you have certain internal constraints, well, all of a sudden things start unclogging. And through that RFP, you realize that you should have been apparently down to closer to like $1.25. Now that'd be a huge win. And sometimes in procurement, you'd stop after the first decrease the supplier gave you and say, that'll stack up towards our 3%. Let's move on. But if you go a little bit deeper and you get down to the $1.29 for running a pointed RFP, okay, now that looks pretty good. And then only since later joining ResinSmart and learning that there's, the well goes deeper, that there's more that you can look into here with understanding how feedstocks have changed over that same time while I was purchasing that resin. It probably should have been closer to $1.05 for that same resin. So to get from where we were all the way down to where we needed to be, needed a lot more information than I had at my fingertips. And what I always kind of lament is, I feel bad that plant had overpaid for that resin for so long. Whereas if it were part of a system that was ongoing monitoring, it could have popped up earlier in my time as a resin buyer that says, hey, I know this is 10th on your list, and it might not drive the needle for your whole procurement initiative, but there's a good amount of money sitting right here because the market has truly diverged from what you're paying.
The main takeaway is, this isn't due to bad luck. It's not because anybody's done anything wrong necessarily. There's a lot of really talented plastic procurement professionals out there. And that, if we talk to on a day-by-day basis, it's the system, right? It's been that way for a long time. The key message is it doesn't have to be that way moving forward. So I want to pivot the conversation quickly and talk about why it's like this, and 2026 is a case study. So as a buyer, very likely you have some data, but it's fragmented within your organization. You may have lagging data on what's happened in the market, and you may have information from your supplier on what the market is doing. All of that is either lagging or it has a perspective that needs to be validated, trusted, but validated. Your supplier's commercial team is in the market every day with hundreds, if not thousands, of transactions. As Bill talked about it, most plastic procurement companies in the small to medium sized band are resource challenged, and maybe they are buying 10, 12 different things in addition to resin. So the information disadvantage is real. And the reality of the history here is that whoever has the resin has typically ruled the negotiation, right? Especially in inflationary environments like we've seen this year. But at the end of the day, the buyer that has better information can challenge the seller, right? It's just how this thing works. So 2026, it's a very different conversation than the one we've had last year. I was reflecting on us doing a Plastics News webinar last year, and that was a very different market. Deflationary, prices were either stale or coming down. And a lot of buyers that we talked to looked pretty good. Not necessarily because they were doing anything different in terms of people, process, or technology, but because of the gravity of the market really coming in their favor. This year has been anything but that. In the first half of the year, polyethylene being the clearest inflationary environment that we've seen in the resins. Prices ran up significantly, over 46 cents a pound, 30 cents in 1 month, as we saw. And here's the part that should make buyers very, very frustrated is when we break down the cost impact across that journey. It's only a fraction of it that's derived from ethylene, that's derived from true feedstock cost movement. The rest was supplier margin expansion. And the supplier that sent you a nomination letter citing cost is only a fraction of the story. The buyers that have the information on what that looks like and can push back at the right time with the right data gave back less. The buyers who weren't, they rode that rocket on the way up all the way. Thankfully, that rocket's running out of steam, if you will, and now we're heading back down. But your prices need to not fall like feathers now. They need to fall like rocks. And I know, Tyler, we're seeing some interesting signals in the engineering resins market right now, especially with benzene, that I think it's worth touching on.
Yeah, we are. We've definitely seen a lot of price increases on the aromatics chain and in the engineered resins in general. A lot of that on the back of benzene, which has kind of skyrocketed since the conflict in Iran. But as we monitored that, we saw that the benzene contract settlement settled quite high in May, way outside of where it was trading for the entire rest of the month. So it looked like a pretty strong predictor that benzene prices were going to come down. And if anything, that contract settlement for benzene in May prolonged what would otherwise be maybe some rebuttals that the buyers could offer based on feedstock and wide availability of the polymers on the marketplace. So after that, sure enough, June benzene came in, settled down. Okay, if we get 60 days in a row of down benzene, it's time to trigger a conversation. Basically just doing, when you think about it, the lack of complexity here is basically you gave us a price increase because you said your raw materials went way up. Okay, well, we're asking for a price decrease, or at least to get back to where we were, because the prices and feedstocks have fallen back down. It's a very fair negotiation principle. But as we look at where benzene is now that the conflict in Iran has kind of fired up anew, and we look at where spot prices are trading and where the contract window is, it looks like the story's a lot less muddled. We're not going to get that 60-day of clearance of contract settlement down. That's going to be exactly the trigger that we would be monitoring to go back and kick off some more of these negotiations. So it's obviously not something to speculate too far on, right? It's just more really monitoring the actual data points to understand the signal and when it's time where if there was kind of a graphic showing buyer on one side and seller on the other, and where the needle's moving for leverage, right? What we're seeing with benzene right now is it's starting to trend back towards the buyer, and now it's sort of stalled and gone back towards the seller in the short term. So, I guess with that being said, it's been a real challenge to break down how much has been cost, how much has been margin, but we're able to do it, track it, and wait until the leverage shifts to be able to articulate it and go back and get what's rightfully our clients.
I think about the metaphor of the tug of war. I can't get that out of my head, buyers and sellers. But anyway, Tyler, thank you for that. I want to pivot the conversation now and talk through what those smart buyers are beginning to do differently. We talked about the inflationary environment, buyers getting squeezed this year, the structural challenges in the market, data asymmetry, the lagging of the data that you may have available if you do under-resourced teams. The buyers that are winning through it all, they're not smarter than you, right? They don't have a fancy degree. It really comes down to changing what you're looking at and the frequency with which you're doing so. And so I want to walk through these three things. The first item is moving away from lagging data to leading data. The winners are using real-time buyer-centric market data, not just the indexes, not the last month's trade press, actual feedstock transactions tied to historical pricing benchmarks that you can help interpret within your business and then use in your negotiations. So that is principle number one for a reason. That's the main differentiation that we see. And then number two is moving from a reactionary mode that most buyers are in right now, especially in this type of year, to being proactive. The best resin buyers don't wait for that nomination letter to hit their inbox. They are observing the signals that are happening in the market, and they're preparing their business themselves to position against it. I came from the supply side of the business. A lot of suppliers have automated the price nomination letter process within their organizations, right? To make it easier, to allow their sellers to go out and do the things that they need to do, build relationships and sell. Well, what if you had a process where you were responding to those automated requests in a way that was maybe some automated to some degree, but with the right level of detail by SKU that allows you to put the supplier on the back foot right away? That is part of what ResinSmart has been built out with. The third thing that I want to mention is moving from assumption to accountability with your vendor partners. So this can be a tricky one, and we are by no means saying you don't trust your suppliers, right? Because this is a relationship industry and always will be. But you need to hold your suppliers accountable with benchmarks that can't be dismissed. A defensible, data-backed number in a negotiation puts that supplier on the back foot and puts you as the buyer in control. I want to take a second to do a quick pulse check. We've got a poll that I want to release to the group here. It's been a wild year in resin pricing. We want to understand how confident are you that your current resin price reflects the actual market? I'm going to let that load here. This is a safe space. I'm not going to call anybody out specifically, but really 4 options. Very confident, meaning, hey, I benchmark myself all the time. Somewhat confident, I might have a tool that I use occasionally. Not very confident, which can be hard to explain. And then for the very vulnerable and honest out there, if you don't know, that would be the 4th choice. All right, we've got the results coming in. I appreciate the honesty from that one individual with number D. It sounds like we've got a good spectrum of folks here, of buyers. What I will say is that for all of you, but especially those that are not very confident or don't have any way of knowing, that is exactly the reason why we've built ResinSmart. So pay attention for the remainder of the conversation here. It would be my advice. With that said, we're going to jump into the meat of the dialogue around what you can do starting today. And again, I can think of no better place to start that conversation than with you, Bill.
Thanks, Michael. You know, a couple things that you and Tyler have said. And by the way, I would have hated to sit down against Tyler with him across the table from me if I was a seller. But one point I want to make, because sometimes I think we can come off like it's an anti or a negative challenging, your challenge your resin supplier. And we don't believe that at all. It's about facts and data. In fact, as I mentored buyers over the last 28 years that we've been doing this, my recommendation is to be positive and build a strong relationship with that supplier. But it's based on facts and data. It's based on being the guy that does his homework, so that when that seller comes in, he knows he's got to have his I's dotted and his T's crossed properly, because like a Tyler, you're going to challenge me on the things that I say. How much of that price increase is margin? How much of it is really market driven? And I think that you being the person that challenges me, example, you don't take care of your health your whole life, and suddenly you have something come up and hit you, you got a problem. But if you're doing the work every day and you're taking care of yourself, when that hits you, you're in a better condition. Another example is just relying on the indexes. Again, I shared how difficult it is to do that job, and I have no desire to ever fill that role. But we have the non-market adjustments we have to deal with. And, you know, the analogy I've got there is I've been paying my mortgage for 3 years, and suddenly my mortgage company calls me and says, oh, by the way, you were on an adjustable mortgage and we didn't drop your price for the last 3 years, and you've overpaid $80,000 a year for your mortgage. Well, we're sorry, but we can't go back and correct that. We're just going to move on. Well, in the case of resin buyers, that's $80,000 is probably a small amount. It's hundreds, if not millions of dollars. So you've got to have multiple data points that you're using to stay on top of the market, and you have to be prepared every day. You can't decide when the rocket's going up, to your analogy, Michael, that suddenly now I'm going to do my homework and I'm going to challenge this time. No, you've got to do it every day, because when you really want to do it, let's be honest, when that rocket's going up and the price increase is 8 cents, you're a hero if you can get it to 7. But when the market's going down and no letters are going out, and you get an offer that, yeah, we'll drop your price 4, what if you make it 8? What if you make it 10? Because you have the data and you have the facts to do that. And I don't know, Michael, if you wanted me to move into the 3 key things that I've always advised buyers to do.
Yeah, please, Bill. And then I know Tyler's going to be chomping at the bit to get in after you there.
Good. Well, he can jump in anytime he wants. But one of the key things we've always shared is, and I think you guys have mentioned it before, is talk to many but buy from a few. What does that mean? That means have a broad base. I talked earlier about being an SPE and buyers being somewhat isolated. Build relationships. Again, it's that time issue that you're going to fight, but as much as you can, be in the industry, go to events, pick up the phone, call people, be in a group chat, whatever it takes, but talk to many and then buy from a few. That means you might be talking to 2 suppliers you don't buy from. But I promise you, if you buy a resin that they could sell you, they'd be very interested in talking to you. And you'll always gain nuggets in those conversations. Expand your supply base. Not easy for everybody to do, but is there one area of your business, one resin you buy where you can expand that, and that you can add a supplier to that? You can add some competition. We've always had a saying, competition is king. And so if you can add competition in any resin category, that creates a different environment across the breadth of what you purchase. So it might be one nylon that you're able to do that to, but you can't do it in your polycarbonate. But you let it be known that you did it in nylon, and you share that information with the supplier. So there's now they're thinking about you a little bit different. You're not standing pat. You're not saying this is acceptable the way it is. I'm going to continue to move and grow. And then the third thing is really expand your resin categories where you can. Add that competition. Add a resin. Review with the engineers. Many times in my career, we've come across a resin that was designated as the resin we need for this widget. And when a full review was done and we did physical testing on the part, we could alter that spec and we can broaden the resin and or the suppliers that could use that material, the material that we use. All have a tremendous impact on the bottom line and on sending a message to your supplier. I'm not standing pat. I'm not happy with where I am. I want to be better.
And I love that example about engineering and procurement being together, right? I've seen it many times in my career where if the engineer and the buyer were exactly the same role, they might have some compounded power to even cross benchmark their own SKUs, right? Like, especially for companies that have grown through acquisition, they end up buying 3 different types of commodity ABSs. You're like, well, these all have very similar chemical properties. They're probably interchangeable. Lower constraints might have to petition the customer or client for the opportunity to consolidate to one or the other. But in other cases, the client controls the resin spec, and it's almost low-hanging fruit. But one of the problems that happens is engineers optimize for performance and procurement folks optimize for price. So how do you get everybody in the same room and scrub through your whole spend and understand where are the realistic opportunities? And is it really cheaper for me to go to a talc-filled polypropylene than use nylon? And then you might say, well, today it's not, but last year it was. Okay, well then what do those look like plotted on graphs over time? And how can we assess that from a engineering and feasibility standpoint, but also from a procurement standpoint? And each one of those projects was multiple hours, multiple meetings. It became quite the endeavor. So what would it look like if more of that was done for you? What if you looked like if you looked at your purchasing on a chemical level, on a raw material level, to be able to make these type of decisions, all with price tacked in? That's one of the big things that, the large databases right now that you can compare resins against is a very useful tool. It just doesn't have pricing, which is quite convenient or decidedly inconvenient if you're a buyer.
Decidedly inconvenient. I love the way you said that, guys. And, the way that I think about that is the buyers aren't necessarily only required to be aware of what's happening in the market, but it's that self-awareness of what can they actually get done within their own organizations, within the engineering world, within the constraints that they have. It can be a missing piece, but what if you had that some help there, right? And that's what ResinSmart can do for you. In terms of real results, so I want to talk through a quick illustrative example of a polyethylene buyer, let's say 20 million pounds a year, gets a supplier nomination letter from earlier this year. Let's just pick one. Let's pick the 30 cent a pound number that many of you saw. The buyer brings that number into the room with them with some additional cost structure context around their specific grade and specific supplier dynamic, and settles for that particular increase at 15 cents a pound, which, if we're doing quick math, that's almost $3 million of cost avoidance in a single negotiation cycle. Now, you're probably saying, well, Michael, they went up again the next month, or, on the way down, either we're going to catch up anyway. But the point I want to make to you is in that one SKU, when you look at that compounded every month, that money is adding up. Even if you're getting some or part or all of it back at some point downstream, you're still incurring that cost. and it has not only the financial benefit or the financial bad guy for you, but it also makes you less competitive in the market on the sales side for that period of time, right? Depending on how you have those costs implemented. And for many companies, we don't just see that in one SKU. It's not a one-story challenge. It's a pattern, and it's not just polyethylene. Same dynamic in the commodity resins and the engineered grades, ABS, nylon, and PVC. Now the specifics are different, but the dynamic is the same. With that said, now I want to pivot the conversation to ResinSmart and how we have created a platform to help you level the playing field as a buyer. So again, we built ResinSmart for one thing, for the buyer to have leverage, additional leverage at the negotiation table in a game that's always been stacked against them. Other tools might tell you where the market's been. We'll tell you where it's going. With that, I did not cue. Perfect. Tyler, I'm going to let you take it away. I got a little carried away and passionate there, as I want to do, but I want you to take us forward and kind of walk us through the methodology of how we do this here at ResinSmart.
Yeah, and I'm going to look at this through the lens of if I were a resin buyer and walked in and was just given a SKU, what would I do with it? Well, the first thing I'd want to know is, over the last 24 months, have I been or have we been following the market based on feedstocks, based on not just the should cost model, but also, some publications and market data on what people have actually been paying for commodity-based engineered resin grades. I just want to know, have we been dealt with fairly, or has margin expanded over the time that we've purchased this? And when you look back at the polycarbonate example I shared earlier, this is probably what that graph would have looked like. We were paying a pretty standard cost, and each year over year, nothing really flags this from a procurement standpoint, right? Maybe the standard cost is based off of whatever last price paid was from the end of last year. So if it moves up just a small tick, maybe it's a bad PPV. But again, there's no call to action on this unless you were to plot it against what the market is for these type of resins. And that's when you would identify, okay, well, clearly our supplier's been speeding on us here, and this is a great place to hunt and kick off a conversation. But then, we might look at that leverage and they might say, well, Tyler, you're buying a medical grade that has, gold flakes and fairy dust in it, and therefore there's no way we're going to allow you to follow the market. You say, well, maybe that's true. And that's when it comes to that engineering collaboration and your internal constraints mapping and finding out, am I really stuck with this? And do we really require gold flake in our polycarbonate? Or is this really not that special and our seller is just making it sound like it is? How do I have a trusted, somebody who doesn't have skin in the game be able to review this? And that's where we would say, then you want to shop the molecule, not the trade name. There's, if that resin really was something that a base polycarbonate could have been used in, then look for base polycarbonate, look for a commodity grade. There's many different suppliers and then distributor channels also that would offer a very solid alternate material, and they'll be at different price bands. So this is a perfect opportunity to run a targeted RFQ, not a generic blast to your distribution folks saying, here's a targeted 10% cost reduction on what we buy already, because I think that's asking the wrong question. If you want to get to the right material at the right price, you have to map it to the raw material, chemical composition, and performance, material performance. Once you do that, then you can also ask yourself some other, maybe up the total cost of ownership curve questions like, is polystyrene really the right resin for this application, or should we use a highly clarified polypropylene? What are the limitations of each of those, and what would it mean for our mold and the release and the shrinkage, and what kind of savings could that drive? And there again, you're back to comparing now two different markets, right? A polystyrene market versus a polypropylene market, and they've inversed in the past. So understanding your risk of and pricing position on each of those resins is critical to understand that before making the decision. And if you wanted different properties for different performance, you could shop that also. And the idea is, if the math is handled by a trigger monitoring price versus market conditions, and the constraints are well mapped, and the engineered side of understanding what you need out of your resin is understood, what that's going to enable is ResinSmart to keep track and be a bit of a watchdog or that analyst for the resin buyer. So the resin buyer can focus on what they really need to be doing, which is building relationships, investing in the plastics community, attending shows, and better understanding the supplier differentiation that's out there so that they can negotiate continuously and with the best data possible.
Yeah, that's great, Tyler. Thank you for walking through that. Bill, I know you have some things to say here around doing your own taxes. I know we kind of mentioned that earlier, but I want to give you an opportunity to kind of weigh in here.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And Tyler, well said. In listening to Tyler and a comment I made earlier about, when I started the industry, and hopefully this has changed a little bit over the years, but it was who's the big bad purchasing guy? I've got the PO book and I'm going to beat you up every time you come in. And I think people over time have figured out that loses credibility. You got to know when that market price is going up and when to shut up, and just know that now's the time to take it. Now's not the time to fight. And then going back to the comment about building a relationship with that resin seller, he's not going to decide your price. The guy calling on you, sitting across the table, isn't going to decide your price. He's going back to somebody at some corporate headquarters or at some regional office that's going to determine the price you pay for resin. So why not empower him and have him on your side helping you sell your case, rather than using threats or challenging him without the facts and without the data? Why put him in that position rather than having him become your advocate? That's the best situation and the best case you could have. Another point I always like to try and make is that nothing that you guys are saying or we're saying here today couldn't be done by anybody that's listening. Short of myself, when I was a young, dumb buyer in my 20s, everybody I've met over the years is very capable of doing these things. It goes back to the issue that I mentioned before. It's about time. How much time do you have? And with all the other responsibilities and priorities you have to do your job, how much time do you have to do that? Because this takes a lot of time. It's about personal relationships and finding those data sources and then being able to trust those data sources or know how much, is the broker I talk to selling me resin? And if he isn't, can I use that information? And it's about laying what he says over what the index has told you, over what you read in Plastics News, over what you heard when you were on a phone call with somebody. It's all those pieces put together that'll help you understand where you should be today and where you need to go tomorrow.
Couldn't have said that any better, Bill. I appreciate you helping us land the plane here. Before we do so and pivot to questions from the audience, and I'll hand it back to you here in a second, Chris. But before we do that, I want to make sure to stress one thing. If anything that we talked about today made you think, as a buyer, hey, what about my prices, right? What do my prices look like against the actual market? Again, that is the business that we're in here. We offer a free benchmark assessment process where we get an NDA done. You bring your spend data and the context on the technical and on the commercial side. We run it through ResinSmart and we tell you where you stand. There's no obligation for that process. There is no pitch. We are going to make a recommendation on places to start. It'll just be, how you stack up in the market. So if you're interested in that, you can find the link to get into that process on the screen here. And with that said, that closes the pre-prepared content that we had Want to say thank you again, and let's get to some questions. Chris, I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. That was great stuff, guys. Really, really well done. Definitely informative and definitely sparked some questions. We've got a bunch to get through here today. So let me go ahead and start with this one. Bill, I think it's for you. It kind of goes back to the part where we were talking about the run up and the current cycle. So, you've been doing this since 1998. How does this cycle, the run up and now softening, compare to past resin market swings that you've lived through?
Chris, much longer than 1998. That's when RTI started. I had to learn. I had a long, some people do the 5-year plan in college. I did like the 10-year plan in the plastics industry to learn what I had to learn before we could do RTI. And again, I'm going to age myself here, but hopefully some of you have seen the movie Groundhog Day.
Oh yeah.
I don't know that I can put it any better than that. It's wake up, wash, repeat. It's you can go back really a little bit before my time to savings and loan crisis, to the dot-com bubble, to the housing, to COVID. Again, I can't stress enough that it's about being prepared every day. It's about being on top of your resin buy every day. It's about having those sources that you can go to, so that you're not just prepping the day that the resin supplier comes in and makes a call on you. You're prepping every day. You know what's going on in the market all the time. It's that important, because you add up that half penny. I don't know how many pounds you buy, but you add up a half penny, and it's a lot of money, and it makes a huge difference again when that product hits the shelf as you go through the whole process. So nothing new here, but it's about being prepared for the rocket, and it's about then, as Michael likes to say, tying the rock to the feather, because nobody's going to send you a price reduction letter.
Yeah, totally fair. All right, this one came in a little bit later on. Some of these questions are a little long, so bear with me as I get through reading them. Our distributors are sharing letters from manufacturers for not only raw material increases, but for surcharges as well. How can we make sure that these surcharges are real and are still implemented by the manufacturer?
I got that one. So I've had a few of these in my career, and to me, it's really about keeping score. So number one, if we're talking about like the fuel surcharge that we've seen quite a few producers and manufacturers start tacking on, they're basically looking at like the U.S. diesel fuel index average price, and they saw that it kicked up over, like, I think it was $4 a gallon was one of the markers where they kind of timing wise started these implementations. So as soon as you get one of those, I think it's fair to rebuttal and say, hey, that's not in the contract. We're not going to accept that. And then, maybe you'll get bulldozed over, unfortunately. But if you do that first stage gate, then it's all about tracking it and monitoring, especially when the diesel fuel comes back down below when they implemented it at, because that's when you have the opportunity, if you lost the initial negotiation, to come back and negotiate on goodwill, which is a principle I talk about often, which comes back down to, hey, you referenced more or less this data point. Diesel fuel is really expensive, so you're going to get a freight surcharge. Okay, fine. But then I'm going to watch that and I'm going to quantify this over time. And as soon as things turn back, I'm coming back to the table with an ask. Oh, and by the way, if we got this through for you, one of the principles in negotiation is try to do your best not to accept something without a concession from the other party. So if they're going to push that through, if you can get any other type of concession, whether it's a payment terms normalization or even a handshake understanding from your in the relationship equity that, hey, okay, we're going to push this through and we're going to not make a big deal out of it. We're going to come back and negotiate this later and track it. But if I ask you for something next time, sample quantities, help finding alternates, whatever it is, make sure that you reciprocate in kind.
Yeah, fair, both fair and keeping that I've heard you all talk about maintaining the relationships and building them, and yeah, it makes total sense. All right, let's go to this one. What if your pricing mechanism is contracted to CMA index?
I can start with that one, and then you guys may want to add in some comments too. We have a lot of clients that negotiate on CMA. And as we talked about before, it's one way to handle contract business in this industry. What we would say to that is just because you tie to an index doesn't mean you have to follow it all the way through the period. There are things that you can do in setting up your contracts in a way that, allows you to have a check in the market, be that annual, biannually, quarterly, whatever the cadence is. There are ways to use data and set up windows and structures and contracts that you can still take advantage of what the index provides. And then there's the idea of, buffer zones, right? We used to call them, collars in my prior life on the sales side. There's ways to structure, again, deals that you can get some of the benefits of the index, but also not have the lag compound on itself. And, you result in overpaying by way more than you should have. Those are just a couple of the things that I think about first with that question. Tyler, Bill, I'm not sure if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I do. That all starts with the beginning negotiation, right? And to Michael's point, I know today that indexed agreements are more acceptable, more in vogue. I can't honestly tell you I ever had a contract that was tied to an index, specifically tied to an index. But I know that suppliers require that sometimes now, and it's just the reality of the world. But to Michael's point, on the front end of that negotiation, okay, I get it. That's what you require. I want to do business with you. But hey, by the way, non-market adjustments are a fact. That's just the reality. We understand how hard what the indexes have to do is. They're trying to represent buyers that buy 1 billion pounds to buyers that buy 500,000 pounds. We get it. But every quarter, we want to sit down and have a conversation. Every quarter, we want to sit down and say, okay, here's the data. Here's what you did with the index, or here's what the index did. There's a disconnect, we think, here, or there isn't. We're fine. Let's go forward. But if there's an index, there's a disconnect, can we do a reset on a quarterly basis so that I don't carry that reset forward for a whole year? Back to my mortgage analysis, right? I paid $80,000 for 3 years, overpaid. I'm $250,000 upside down on my mortgage, and now it's too late. So that's on the front end of the negotiation. Sorry.
No, I agree with that, Bill. There's one other insight that I'd like to share, and this is just my own, just really Tyler Wheeler's own view of the resin market. But I think that if you look at resin buyers, there's a standard distribution curve, and on both ends of the distribution curve are spot buyers. So if you're a novice, you're probably buying spot. But if you're an expert, you're also probably buying spot. You're just doing so for two very different reasons. And if you're in the middle, you're basically using the industry leading tool for solving the time problem, which is I don't have enough time to negotiate or to understand all the dynamics behind this resin market. And I don't have the time to go negotiate with my sales folks every month. So let's follow an index. Or as you mentioned, maybe it's for customer compliance. But if you're really, really good at buying resin, I would argue that you're probably a spot buyer.
All right. I like that. It was like the questions like this next one, right? Someone sitting in the audience who's like, all right, I got these experts here in this room. I'm gonna ask for some help. So Tyler, maybe directed at you. If I'm buying ABS or PC this week, what do I actually do with the benzene spread you showed? Walk me through it like I'm sitting across from my supplier tomorrow.
Well, if you're negotiating today, that's tough timing, first of all. Rough. But let's just say the contract's up and it's now or never and you have to do it, right? I would basically share my interpretation of what's happened in benzene, which would put the supplier in a position where they have to refute it in some way. I don't think that they can in an effective way. I would just look at the data itself and say, based on where contract is landed, based on where spot prices are trending, and based on macroeconomic forecast that any resin buyer kind of has in their back pocket, I would say based on those things, this is where we see you've taken margin over the life of this term, whether they're following an index or spot buying, and say, moving forward, we'd like to get back to the margin position that you were in prior to this conflict. And that's a starting point for the price negotiations. That's fact-based, that's data-based. I think there's a lot of other levers that you should be thinking about and exploring in conversations with your sales folks and with your network and at different conferences and understanding different points of the market so that you can bolster that case. But if you want to know just how I would use feedstock in that, it would really be to do a margin assessment and say, let's make it fair for both of us moving forward.
Like it. Good advice. Good question. Good advice.
Yeah, good question.
Here we go with another similar. So someone is asking, do large customers have master purchase agreements with specific pricing per month? Oh, Michael, I don't hear you.
Yeah, weird. Lost your audio.
That was weird. I'm not sure how that happened. My computer muted itself. Technology these days. Apologies for that.
No, you're good.
I'll take a first stab at that answer. Tyler, Bill, please, if you've got other things to add. I would say that, larger companies, it doesn't necessarily need to be larger companies, right? It can be size of buy. But yeah, where you have contracts that are tied to a master purchase agreement or some sort of contract, we have seen instances where specific pricing can, be there from every month, right? In the contract side, on the spot side, that can vary, within the month, right? It all depends on when you're coming in to purchase. But I would say that it doesn't necessarily just mean large customers can have specific pricing per month, and it doesn't necessarily require a master purchase agreement. But it certainly helps to have one, especially if you have a very long relationship, a very complex relationship with your vendor that requires, terms of service and use and, some of that other stuff that typically is governed by an MPA or an MSA. Tyler, anything to add there that I missed?
No, I think that about covers it. I think that you wouldn't do a forward price locking in type agreement, because what you end up tripping up is like, okay, we'll lock our price if you lock our volume. And then that puts everybody in kind of a poor position. It's not industry standard. So I think most of what you shared is exactly right, Michael.
Great. All right. I think we've got time for probably one more. So let me take this one. Do you have many customers using the data towards recycled materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, what I would say is yes. As we know, on the recycled market, the secondary market, if you will, that market typically is out in front of what the prime market does. So, Bill, I know, back to the RTI days, we've been monitoring the secondary market for many years. There is a difference between, the benchmarks that we monitor in that market are going to be different. We certainly saw the secondary market get some pricing momentum by what happened earlier in the year. So those prices definitely came up and have had to come down with the prime prices following it. The simple answer is we have to pay attention to the secondary market. There is some fragmentation and some challenge with that market with the regional flair and in the freight component that can be challenging for certain customers if they're very regionalized to understand. But yes, it's a part of what we monitor here at ResinSmart.
Yeah, it's an interesting bit of history about RTI, because my background, Lowell Hoovenen, one of our key employees that's been with us from the beginning, Garland Strong, my partner, part of our whole portfolio was in recycled resin and spot resin. And when we started RTI, we thought a big part of what we would do was help companies understand how they could move into those areas. And we found out real quickly that was not going to be our business model. It was going to really be helping those clients that are buying the resin they're currently buying and using market indicators to buy that resin at a better price and have a better relationship with their supplier. But having said that, as Michael's point about recycled resin leading. If I'm going to give away some pieces here, what we're watching and what all of our clients are providing and what we pay attention to is recycled market, the generic prime market, the spot market, the prime markets, the export markets, what's going on in Asia, what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the Middle East. We're paying attention to that global, but the whole array, not just this widget of resin, but everything within that category of polyethylene or polycarbonate, everything that's happening in that arena. It's critical to know, and it's critical for us to know what's the new technology. We've helped some of the new recycling technology come to market because we understood it was going to be good for the industry and good for our clients. So pay attention to all of it and know exactly where it's at and where it's going.
Yeah, that's awesome. Guys, this is great. We've got probably another dozen questions that are sitting here. So I'll just, everyone whose question we didn't get to, I would encourage you to reach out to these guys and the contact information you got. I see them at our Plastics News events at Executive Forum. I know they like meeting with their customers and talking about their expertise. So don't be shy to reach out. And I want to thank Michael, Tyler, and Bill for their expertise and their time today. We'll follow up with information. This will also be available on plasticsnews.com. So if you want to share this with any colleagues who didn't get a chance to attend, you can do that as well. We'll get that up in the next 24 hours so you can go back and view it and share it and all that good stuff. But Michael, Tyler, Bill, thank you so much. That was great. And everybody out there, thank you for your questions, your engagement. And we hope to see you on a Plastics News webinar again soon. Thank you.
Chris, thank you. Thank you, Plastics News.
Have a great summer.
Yeah, you too.